everyone, and welcome to video number 9 of Unit 4, Expansion, Regionalism, Reform from 1800 to 1848. Okay, we're getting pretty close to the end, guys. Today we're going to be looking at African Americans in the early republic, which is AP topic 4.12. So let's get started. Okay, let's start with what was life like for free African Americans in the North and South? So something to keep in mind, and I know I've discussed this in classes and in videos before, but keep in mind that at the outset of the 19th century, so late 18th, early 19th century, many, including many of the founding fathers, sort of hoped that slavery would simply gradually disappear. In the South, right? In the South, we're starting to see the exhaustion of coastal soil in the Virginia, the Carolinas. I mean, these areas have been worked or overworked with very intensive forms of plantation agriculture, primarily tobacco and cotton, for a century or more. So the soil was really, really overworked. The constitutional ban on importing Africans after 1808 that was written into the Constitution meant that the slave trade, bringing in new slaves to the United States, would no longer be legal after 20 years after the Constitution was written. And we started also, as I discussed in the last video, to see the growth of abolitionist movements, entirely in the North, really. Even though these movements were small, they were growing. However, as we've seen in some of the videos and some of the things we've discussed, in the 19th century, we're also going to see this rapid growth of industry. And the challenge here is that with the growth of industry and manufacturing, you're going to see a big demand for raw material like cotton, which was the primary cash crop of the South. And this is going to be made more possible by Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin allowed for cotton to be cleaned really rapidly. Before this, cotton had to be picked clean by hand. It was a really slow, arduous process. And so it didn't really matter how much cotton you could grow. There was a big bottleneck when it came to actually cleaning the cotton and preparing it to be then manufactured into thread and eventually cloth. So with the invention of the cotton gin, that bottleneck is going to be removed. You could clean cotton so much faster that it sort of came down to, for the South, well, as much cotton as you can grow and put under cultivation could be then cleaned and sold, which equals huge profits. So this big growth of industry and textile manufacturing is really going to lead to a huge corresponding demand in the demand for raw materials like cotton. And then, of course, the corresponding growth of plantation slavery. And then, of course, we're also going to see expansion of slavery west. As Western states and territories open up, new states like Alabama and Mississippi are also going to see the rise of these plantation structures. Okay, so in 1860, the dawn of the Civil War, there were about 500,000 free African Americans in the U.S., and they were actually pretty evenly split between North and South. Each had about 250,000. Now, in the North, those 250,000 were only 1% of Northerners. It was a very, very small group of people because the North was very populated, densely populated. The urban areas were mostly in the North. So in the North, free African Americans were able to maintain a family, and in some places, they could own land, although they were restricted in other places. Now, as we discussed briefly in the last video, the North was not just this bastion of freedom and equality, even though we sometimes think of it that way. It really wasn't. There was a great deal of discrimination in the North. By no means did Northern whites, for the most part, except for kind of the most radical of abolitionists, really believe in equality between races. There was a great deal of discrimination in all sectors of society, including in churches. So white-owned churches who discriminated against African Americans eventually led to the development of separate congregations, like, for example, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which of course still exists today. Northern African Americans lacked political and economic equality. They couldn't vote. They could not hold jobs in skilled professions or crafts workers unions. By the mid-19th century, immigrants are going to come in and start to replace a lot of the laboring that African Americans did. So immigrants displaced them from many occupations, and they were denied membership in unions. So the small kind of early unions that begin to form with early industrialization are not going to admit, at least in the early 19th century, African Americans. And in fact, African American laborers were often brought in as strike breakers. When unions would strike, they, refused, all their members would refuse to work. But because African Americans were denied membership in those unions, they were often brought in as workers to do the work until the strike was broken, the strike was over. And then they, of course, would be dismissed once that strike was over. Now, in the South, again, we're going to see about 250,000 free citizens, but just like in the North, more so, as you might imagine, their liberties are also going to be restricted. Now, where did these free African Americans come from in the South? Because as you might imagine, white Southerners didn't love the idea of free African Americans with autonomy, demonstrating to their enslaved brethren that it was possible to live a life outside of slavery. So many of these Southern free African Americans came from, actually were emancipated during the American Revolution, or their parents were emancipated during the Revolution for a variety of reasons, usually for some service, for working as soldiers. Some of them were actually mixed children. Some of them were mixed children whose white fathers had been plantation owners, or possibly their mother's plantation owners who liberated their children. And some very few amount were able to purchase their own freedom. This was pretty rare. Again, not only because mostly white Southerners didn't really like to manumit or free their slaves, but also because it was really hard to purchase your freedom. It was expensive. And the only ones who could really afford to do it were the few slaves that were working in specialized professions. So in the few small cities and port towns, mostly men that worked as laborers, as maybe skilled professions, as apprentices to carpenters or blacksmiths, that eventually were able to earn enough money to purchase their own freedom. And again, this was very rare because most slaves, or rather enslaved persons in the South, were agricultural workers, and they could virtually never save up the kind of money that they would need to purchase their own freedom, namely because they were not paid, which is sort of, I suppose, the point of an enslaved labor force. Okay, so in the South, most lived in cities. Most of the free African Americans lived in cities, not in rural areas. In cities, they could often own property. Now, they weren't considered equal to whites. They were not permitted to vote. They were barred from many occupations. And the additional danger, of course, in living in the South as a free African American was there was constant danger of kidnapping by slavers. Someone who would just come along and claim that, oh, that was my slave and they ran away, but now they're my slave and I take them. And the courts, as you might imagine, were not always fair to African Americans who were captured and enslaved by slavers. They tended to take give the white enslaver the benefit of the doubt. So there was that constant danger of living in the South as well as a free African American. Okay, so what were some of the covert and overt ways that enslaved people used to resist the dehumanizing effects of slavery? So it's really worth noting that enslaved lives were not solely defined by dehumanization and misery, although obviously those existed, but they also had a really rich social identity and culture which belonged to them and was sort of the forebearers for a lot of today's culture. So, despite having English names, many enslaved people continue to address each other by African names in order to sustain their cultural and communal heritage. We also see the use of West African and Caribbean languages amongst themselves. And in some areas, we're going to start to see sort of pidgin languages emerge, like in, I believe, South Carolina and North Carolina, Geechee or Gullah. So some of these kind of Caribbean languages were maintained as a sort of pidgin language. Folk tales, dance, and music were really common as a way for enslaved people to entertain each other, maintain their own culture, and maintain community. And this culture often was spread to the South, quite unintentionally, I'm sure, because enslaved people often were sold away from their farms and plantations. They went to cotton markets and were sold away from their families, or sometimes they married each other secretly. So this culture was spread. And then we end up seeing a development of syncretized religion as well. Some African Muslims continued to pray to Allah and perform rituals. Muslim prayer rituals, and some embraced Christianity because of really powerful Black preachers who emerged, who combined African elements with American elements like drums and dancing. So the Black experience under slavery was not entirely defined by their masters, and the maintenance of culture in these communities represented a very subtle resistance to slavery, to the dehumanizing effects of slavery, which tried to take away the culture and thereby identity of the people who were enslaved. So more overt forms of resistance obviously existed as well in the form of rebellion. And this was surely the greatest fear of the slaveholding elite was slave rebellion. The Haitian Revolution in 1804 is definitely going to contribute to this, the most successful slave rebellion in history, which leads to the development of independent country. Plantation owners went to enormous lengths to suppress cultural expression as much as possible of their enslaved workers, although as we discussed, we see this definitely still flourishing in secret. In 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia happens because an enslaved worker named Nat Turner believed that God had chosen him for a mission, for freeing people from slavery. So he began killing his masters in Virginia. Then he headed to other plantations to do the same. Turner and his followers killed 57 white people. And the next day, the Virginia militia was sent out. They encountered the rebels. They squashed the rebellion. And Turner and 55 others were hanged. And of course, there was a huge reaction to this. Virginia planters panicked. They beat and they sold 200 of their enslaved workers, and they killed many of them. Another pretty dramatic example of an overt slave rebellion was the Amistad, was on the ship the Amistad, which was a Spanish slave ship in 1839. It was packed with enslaved people that were being transported from West Africa to the West Indies. Now, the cook apparently on the ship, the white cook on the ship, made a joke to the slaves in the hold that they would be killed and cooked for food. And that was a mistake. One man got free, and then he freed the others. And they said, well, if we have nothing left to lose anyway, because they're going to kill us, then we might as well try to stop them. So they freed the others. They killed the cook and the ship's captain. Eventually, they were going to get caught. They actually get put on trial in the United States. And John Quincy Adams is the lawyer who defends them super eloquently. And ultimately, the trial was actually decided in favor of the rebels, who were freed and were able to go back to West Africa. So that was a pretty rare type of story. So as a result of these rebellions, however, lives of enslaved people definitely became more difficult because white owners are going to seek to gain a strict measure of control over them through slave codes. So between 1820 and 1840, a lot of Southern legislatures made it illegal to free a slave in the state. Many of them deemed it a crime to teach slaves to read and write and made it illegal to do that. And many of them outlawed marriage between enslaved people and abolished their access to courts entirely. And the justification for these measures was that enslavers were telling themselves that enslaved people were not people at all, but more like farm animals. And as such, they didn't have rights in court or anywhere else. They said, well, we wouldn't give a cow a right in court to sue someone in court. So why should slaves have this right? Should enslaved people have this right? So they actually, according to the Southern justification, racial justification, was that enslaved peoples, quote unquote, benefited from slavery because they were cared for. And we know, obviously, that is insane from our modern sensibilities, but that, and even for the time period, many abolitionists and Northerners recognized the inherent, discrepancies in this argument. But that was the justification. I mean, nobody wants to be on the wrong side of history, and nobody wants to consider themselves as evil. And so certainly there was this really strong moral and often religious backed justification saying that no, slavery is right, slavery is good. It's actually good for the slaves. Okay, so that's all we're going to be talking about today. We'll see you next time for our very final video of Unit 4, video number 10.